Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Anna Petrovna Bunina's poem, Conversation Between Me and the Women, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So Bunina was a late 18th, early 19th century poet. She lived from 1774 to 1829, so Romantic era. One of the interesting things about her, according to the introduction here in the Norton Anthology, is although she was poor, her independence, that is independent, she was unmarried, she didn't have a father taking care of her. Although she was poor, her independence was an extraordinary accomplishment. She was the first Russian woman to earn her living as a writer. So that's really kind of interesting. And it's significant because obviously in this era, it was just harder to earn a living as a writer in general. There was not as much of a market for books, in part because there was more limited publishing opportunities. But there was also just a smaller literate public. Particularly this was the case in Russia. Where only about, according to the introduction here, only about 6% of Russian men could read in 1800 and 4% of women. Russia also was a relatively backwards country still at this point compared to Western Europe, despite the attempts of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great to drag Russia into the modern era. Russian industry was still less developed. Russian publishing was less developed. It says here only about 250 titles were published in Russia each year between 1800 and 1820, compared to 4,500 in France. So making a living as a writer was definitely not easy. And one of the ways in which Bunina was able to do this was actually by publishing a handbook called The Rules of Poetry, which became quite successful. But her poems are, in many ways, somewhat typical Russian poems of this time. There is a lot of pastoral element, there's a lot of nationalism, there's a lot of religious imagery, iconography, etc., etc. The real big difference, of course, is that Bunina is writing from a woman's perspective, and so her takes on these things are slightly different than her male counterparts. And actually, Conversation Between Me and the Women is focused on her unique position as a female writer in Russia. And much of the women's side of the conversation, this is a sort of chorus of cosmopolitan Russian women, much of their side of the conversation is focused on, initially, men don't adequately represent women's experience in their poetry. And then when Bunina talks about what she writes about, these pastoral poems, these sort of glorious battle scenes of warriors fighting for the Tsar, the religious poetry, etc., etc., the women are like, you're not writing about us either. Why not? And ultimately, I'll get to Bunina's answer after I talk a little bit more in depth about this poem itself. But she has an answer, and what that answer is it's interestingly complex. It reflects multiple, or it bears multiple potential readings. So, the poem starts with the chorus of women. Our sister dear, what joy for us, you are a poetess, your palate's able, holding all shades to paint an ode, a fable. Your heart must brim with praise for us. A man's tongue, though, God preserve us, dear, sharp as a knife is sharp. In Paris, London, as in Russia here, they're all the same. On just one string they harp, naught but abuse. Ladies always suffer. We wait for madrigals, its epigrams they offer. Don't expect brothers, husbands, fathers, sons to praise you even once. How long we've lacked a songstress of our own. So do you sing? Pray answer yes or no. So the opening, again, we have this immediate complaint lodged against male poets that they are critical of women, that women come across badly in men's poetry. And we might think about damsels in distress, whose role is entirely to just sort of be in trouble and have a man save them. We might think about temptresses. We might think about haughty ice queens and these other sort of traditional poetic roles for women. And that's really what the women are complaining about here. And again, they ask Bunina if she writes. What does she write? And Bunina gives this, I think, really quite beautiful description of pastoral poetry as the first thing. She says, I sing all nature's beauteous hues above the flood, the horned sickle moon. I count the little drops of dew, I hymn the sun's ascension in the morn. Flocks gambolling in the fields enjoy my care, I give reed pipes unto the shepherdesses. Flowers I entwine in their companions' tresses that are so flaxen fair. I order them to take each other's hands to caper to a dance as their fleet feet pass, to trample not a single blade of grass. Up to the heavens' rocky crags I raise, I plant out branchy trees, to rest an old man in their shady breeze on summer's sultry days. I search the roses for bright insects' wings, and having summoned feathered birds to sing, I languish pale to the sweet warble of the nightingale. Or, all at once, freeing the horses' manes, I order them to race the wind, and with their hooves dust to the clouds they fling. I draw a cornfield crowned with ears of grain, which from the sun's bright rays take on the look of seas, of molten gold, sways, ripples, dazzles, shines, blinding the eye, as humble ploughmen their reward behold. In fortifying my own timid voice, through nature's loveliness, I'm braver in a flash. And the women are not pleased with this response. They want poems focused on them. They want poems praising women, in contrast, again, to the male-authored poems that are critical of women. But what they ask about is what people have you written poems about? And Bunina responds by talking about nationalistic poetry, men fighting for the Tsar, for their country. She talks about religious piety, things like this. And the women are, again, not pleased with this. So their sort of closing critique is, and here again we're missing from your rhymes. You do us quite a service, so what good are you? Don't you make things worse? Why did you bother learning to sing verse? You ought to take your themes from your own circle. 'Tis only men you honor with your lays, as if their sex alone deserved your praise. You traitorous, give our case some thought, for is this what you ought? Are their own fonts of flattery too few, or can they boast of more than our virtue? So this is an interesting critique, because again, they're arguing that on some level, Bunina has a moral responsibility as a female poet to say good things about women, specifically to write women-centered poetry. And they make some compelling arguments here. This idea, 'tis only men you honor with your lays, as if their sex alone deserved your praise. Again, this idea that women have largely been erased from literary history, which is true. although increasingly we are sort of rediscovering female writers and bringing them to the forefront of the canon. So that's a good thing now. But in 1800, that wasn't the case, of course. And this other critique here, are their own fonts of flattery too few, or can they boast of more than our virtue? There were a lot of male poets around at the time who were very, very happy to say good things about men. That's a fair critique. I mean, it feels like it's a reasonable thing to say, hey, we've got a ton of male poets saying good stuff about men and bad stuff about women. You are our one female poet we've got around. Why can't you write some good stuff about women? There's already enough men doing this. You don't need to add more praise to men. And then here's Bunina's final answer. And it's an interesting one because it can be read in, I would say, two strikingly different ways. It's true, my dears, you are no less, but understand, with men, not you, the courts of taste are manned, where authors all must stand, and all an author's fame is in their hands, and none can help loving himself the best. And then there's a footnote here, Bunina's footnote. May I be forgiven for this jest in deference to the merry muses who love to mix business with idleness, lies with truth, and to enliven conversation with innocent playfulness. And so she tells us overtly, as if it weren't going to be clear, that this final stanza, in which she gives her answer, her explanation of why she writes about men, that this is a mixture of truth and critique. It is a mixture of sort of acknowledging the reality that men are in this time, the consumers of literature, that men decide what is and is not good writing, and generally that men are the literary elite. And so, in order to succeed as a poet, Bunina has to appeal to them because, as she says, none can help loving himself the best. As a female poet, she is aware of how precarious her position is as a writer. And so in order to maintain that, she has to write for the audience that can and will pay for her verse. And that's men. And on the one hand, this is a rebuttal to the women, the chorus of women, because she's saying, hey, I'm not going to write about women because you as women don't get to decide what is and isn't considered good poetry and whether or not I'm going to make a living doing this. Men have that power, and so I'm going to write for them. On the other hand, this is a critique of that situation. I am only writing about men and saying good stuff about men because they have the power to determine whether or not I succeed as a poet. And so what a clever reader may find here is a subtle inversion of this. Men are actually not necessarily in Bunina's mind here, or in the poet persona's mind, I should say. Men are not necessarily worthy of praise and more poetry, but because they have power, it's inescapable. She has to do this. The poet persona has to write these poems whether she wants to or not. And I think that's a really interesting, subtle critique of the Russian literary world at this time, but also the literary world more broadly, even in a place like France, where actually women were at the forefront of literary salons and things like this. Women were central to organizing these literary spaces. It was still male writers and male critics who really determined what was good.